Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The recycled air on Ankor Drift smelled, on good days, like the inside of a plastic bottle that had once held something vaguely citrus. On bad days, and the days had been bad for 6 consecutive weeks, it smelled like the plastic bottle had given up on the citrus ambition entirely and was simply being honest about what it was. Marcus Aley had stopped noticing it sometime in year 2. That was either professional adaptation or personal defeat, and he had made peace with not knowing which. He was on his 3rd coffee of the morning, which was ambitious given that the morning was 40 minutes old, and he was staring at the intake queue on his workstation, the way a man stares at a structural crack in a wall he is responsible for but cannot fix, with full attention and absolute helplessness. The queue had 411 entries. Yesterday it had been 403. He had processed 19 cases. The math was not encouraging, and Marcus had always been better at math than optimism. The coordination hub occupied what had originally been designated as a temporary overflow annex to the station's 3rd administrative module, which itself had been a temporary expansion of the 2nd, which had been bolted onto the original core structure during the Pelhari displacement event 9 years ago, when someone in central governance had decided that temporary was a perfectly reasonable foundation for a permanent problem. The ceiling was 2 centimeters lower than standard habitat spec. The lighting panels on the east wall cycled through a faint, irregular flicker that maintenance had been scheduled to address 4 times and had addressed 0. The motivational display screen that someone in station management had installed above the main entrance, presumably with good intentions, the road being well paved as always, read today is an opportunity in clean sans serif lettering, which Marcus had reprogrammed on his 2nd week to read today is a Tuesday, and which no one had corrected because no one disagreed. He pulled the first file from the queue. Family of 4, Dravathi, secondary displacement. They had been moved once already from their original emergency shelter on Vaelith Station when that facility hit capacity, which meant they had been living in temporary accommodations for 22 months across 2 different orbital platforms, carrying everything they owned in approved-size storage containers, their children doing school through a tablet with intermittent connectivity. He read the case notes. He added his own. He flagged the housing compatibility assessment as priority. He moved the file forward in the chain and watched it slot neatly into the next review stage, where it would wait for a Tier 3 authorization that was, according to the system, estimated in 4 to 6 weeks. He reached over and picked up the paper notepad on the corner of his desk. It was a deliberate anachronism in a room full of haptic surfaces and environmental displays, and his colleagues had questioned it exactly once early on, after which they had apparently concluded it was a harmless eccentricity in an environment that had produced stranger ones. He found the current column and wrote a small mark in the margin. Not a placement, just an acknowledgement that someone was still in the queue and he had not forgotten them. It was a meaningless gesture in practical terms. He did it anyway. The door to the hub slid open with its characteristic pneumatic sigh. The door gasket needed replacing, and had needed replacing for 8 months, and the facility's request had been submitted 3 times and absorbed into the same administrative void that seemed to consume all non-critical maintenance tickets. And Vaelith Sonn walked in carrying 2 sealed cups from the station's food service corridor, and the expression of someone who had already read the morning's logistics briefing and had opinions about it that she was organizing into order of severity. She was tall. She moved with the particular economy of someone who had decided, at some point, that unnecessary motion was a resource expenditure that the day's budget could not support. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that suggested functionality rather than style, and under the flickering east wall panels it caught the light strangely, blue for a moment, then a warm bronze, then simply dark again, as though it couldn't quite commit to a single answer. She set one of the cups on his desk without breaking stride toward her own station, without comment, without the performance of generosity. Just the cup, placed in the precise location where his previous cup had been, which meant she had clocked where he kept it and factored it into her approach path. And both of those things were so characteristic of how she moved through a workspace that Marcus had stopped finding them remarkable and had started finding them quietly, like architecture. Something you don't notice until you try to imagine the room without it. She sat. Her workstation woke at her proximity, 3 displays arranging themselves into her preferred configuration. She read for approximately 40 seconds. Then she said, without looking up, that the Dravathi secondary review queue had grown by 8 entries overnight due to a jurisdictional reclassification that someone in Central had pushed through at 11 the previous evening, and that whoever had approved that reclassification had clearly never spoken to an actual Dravathi family, and had possibly never spoken to an actual family of any kind. Marcus picked up his coffee. "I'm going to need you to tell me," he said, "that there's a reasonable explanation for why a reclassification that affects 230 open cases was processed at 11 at night by someone who left no contact flag and no review window." Vaelith's fingers pressed together in that slow, rhythmic way of hers, index to middle, a steady pulse like she was counting something internal. "There is no reasonable explanation," she said. "Wonderful." He drank his coffee. "I'll update my expectations accordingly." 3 weeks after the reclassification, someone in Central's infrastructure division pushed a routine synchronization update to Ankor Drift's administrative nodes at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, which was, as far as anyone could determine afterward, the only thing that could be said in its defense. It was routine. It was 2 in the afternoon. Everything else about it was a cascading systems failure that consumed 6 months of secondary review queues across all 3 nodes, corrupted the backup indices, and generated an error report so long that the error report itself crashed the display terminal assigned to render it. Marcus found out via an automated alert that arrived on his personal communicator at 2:17, while he was in the middle of explaining to a Tier 2 intake officer why cultural compatibility assessments for species who did not, technically, have a concept of residential permanence could not be evaluated using a form designed for species who did. He read the alert. He read it again. He excused himself from the conversation in a way that was polite enough to be professional and clipped enough to be honest, walked back to the coordination hub, and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the diagnostic displays, which were showing, in aggregate, the administrative equivalent of a car that had driven off a cliff and was currently expressing surprise about gravity. Vaelith was already at her station. She had pulled up the corruption logs on 2 of her 3 displays and was reading through them with the focused stillness of someone who had not yet decided whether what they were looking at was a catastrophe or something else. Her fingers were doing the counting pulse thing, both hands. "Tell me," Marcus said, sitting down, "the scale." "The secondary review queues for the last 6 months are gone," she said. "The backups are partially recoverable, but the index mapping is corrupted, which means even the recoverable data cannot be correctly attributed to specific cases without manual reconstruction. That process would take, at current staffing levels, approximately 4 months." Marcus looked at his screen. He looked at the hub ceiling, specifically at the flickering east wall panel, which chose this moment to cycle through its irregular blink as though acknowledging the drama of the situation. He looked back at his screen. "The 12 Dravathi cases," he said, "the ones frozen on secondary review, are no longer frozen on secondary review," Vaelith said, "because the secondary reviews that were freezing them no longer exist in any recoverable form in the system. And reinstating them would require a directive from a Tier 4 administrator. Director O'Hala is at the Governance Assembly on Vaelith Station until the 14th. Marcus was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "I need you to confirm, very precisely, that you are telling me what I think you are telling me." Vaelith looked at him. Her pupils were their standard vertical slit configuration in the afternoon lighting, which always gave her a quality of attention that felt slightly more concentrated than a human face could manage. "I am telling you," she said with precision, "that there is currently no active secondary review block on the 12 pending Dravathi cases, and that there will be no mechanism to reinstate one until the 14th at the earliest, and that case processing is permitted to continue during system recovery periods under Provision 7 of the Continuity of Services Protocol." "Provision 7, Marcus said. "Provision 7, she confirmed. He opened the first of the 12 cases. "We should probably get started." They worked through the night. This was not a metaphor or a compression of time. They genuinely worked through the full cycle of the station's night period, through the shift change at 2200 when the rest of the hub's staff rotated out, through the point at which the environmental system reduced the lighting to its amber low-power mode, through the 4 in the morning slump that Marcus addressed with stimulant tabs he kept in his desk drawer for the specific category of emergency that could not be fixed with coffee alone, through the slow gray-green of the station's artificial dawn cycle beginning to filter through the hub's narrow viewport strips at 6. The cases moved, one by one, then in pairs when they found processing efficiencies. The files cleared their final stages and converted from open to placed. Marcus updated his notepad. He had started a second column. By hour 28, the humor had gone from deliberate to involuntary, which was how he knew they were both running low. Vaelith had begun narrating bureaucratic obstacles in a tone so flat it had become its own form of comedy, delivering sentences like, "The Nutrition Accommodation Cross-Reference Protocol was apparently updated at 3 in the morning by a working group whose existence I cannot locate in any committee registry," with the precise inflection of someone reading aloud from a document they have decided not to be angry at, which was somehow funnier than anger would have been. Marcus had stopped editing himself, which meant that the observations he normally kept internal were arriving externally, including a 10-minute digression on what kind of person, voluntarily, joins a nutrition accommodation cross-reference working group, and what that said about the organizational culture that had made such a group feel necessary. Vaelith said that she believed such people existed, because every system required someone willing to care about things no one else would care about, and that this was philosophically defensible even if the practical output was difficult to forgive. Marcus said that was an extraordinarily generous interpretation of a working group that had just cost them 40 minutes on the second-to-last case of a 30-hour processing run. She said she was a generous person. He said he knew. The last case was a family of 5. They had been on Ankor Drift for 26 months. Their intake photograph, which the system displayed in the upper corner of the case file, showed 2 adults and 3 children who had the particular quality of stillness that Marcus had come to recognize over 4 years. The way people looked when they had learned that visible hope was a resource better conserved. He worked through the placement confirmation. The system, which had been mostly cooperative for the last several hours, selected this moment to generate a new validation error about cross-referencing cultural nutrition accommodations with housing unit specifications, which was a requirement that had not existed in the protocol 48 hours ago. He stared at it. The amber light was warm on the screens. The station was quiet. Vaelith was waiting for the same output he was, and neither of them had slept, and the error message sat in the center of his display with the cheerful indifference of all systems that do not know and do not care what is at stake on the other side of them. "You know," Marcus said, to the screen, to the empty room, to no one in particular, in the voice he used when the only available response to something was to make it slightly absurd. "At this rate, I should just marry you so at least one of us gets a happy ending out of this bureaucratic nightmare." He had already looked back at the error message by the time the silence started. He noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping, first the absence, then the shape of the absence. He looked up. Vaelith was looking at him, not with surprise, with something that had the texture of a conclusion. Her pupils had expanded in the amber low light into something wide and dark and very still, and the subdermal luminescence at her temples was slow and steady and gold, the way it got when she had been thinking about something for a long time. She did not smile. She did not deflect. She held his gaze across the space between their workstations with the full, quiet weight of someone who had already done the calculation and was now simply delivering the result. "Make me happy," she said. 2 words. No question mark. The validation error sat uncorrected on his screen. The family of 5 was still, technically, waiting. Marcus's hand was still on the keyboard, and he became aware of this in a distant, secondary way, the way you become aware of your own breathing when someone has just said something that has rearranged the room. He finished the placement confirmation. He typed through it with the mechanical steadiness of someone who has decided that the most useful thing available to him in this specific moment is to complete the task in front of him. Because the task in front of him has a family of 5 attached to it who have been waiting for 26 months, and who deserve not to wait any longer because the person processing their file has temporarily lost his grip on the ordinary sequence of cause and effect. He clicked through the validation error using a manual override provision that should technically have required supervisor authorization, and that he authorized himself on the basis that he was, at this precise moment, the most senior person in the building, and also the only person in the building. The confirmation processed. The file converted from open to placed. He picked up his notepad and wrote the number and put the notepad down and did not look at it again. Vaelith said nothing further. She closed the cases on her displays in order, methodically, and compiled the processing report for the shift handover. And when the morning rotation arrived at 7, she gave them a briefing that was complete and professional, and contained no reference to anything that had happened in the previous 31 hours except the casework. Marcus listened to it from his station. His coffee had gone cold. He drank it anyway. He slept for 6 hours in his station quarters, which was not enough, and returned to the hub for the afternoon shift, which was perhaps not the decision a person operating at full psychological capacity would have made, but was the decision available to him. And Marcus had long since made a practical accommodation with the difference between ideal choices and present ones. Vaelith was already at her station. The new intake queue had 37 entries. The day proceeded. This was the part that no one who had not done this kind of work would understand, and that everyone who had done it understood without needing to be told. The cases do not pause. There is no institutional mechanism for personal revelation. The families in the queue were still in the queue regardless of what had been said in the amber-lit hours before dawn, and the only honest response to that fact was to work, which they did, side by side, in the same configuration they had occupied for 7 months, with the same shorthand and the same division of difficult conversations, and the same recycled air that smelled of nothing in particular. The difference was a frequency shift, something in the register of the room that Marcus could not have quantified but could not stop noticing, like a piece of equipment running a degree warmer than its baseline, technically operational, not quite usual. He made 3 jokes in the first 2 hours that did not land the way they should have. He was aware of this while making them, which was unusual. Normally, the jokes were reflexive, a pressure valve that opened without consultation. These felt slightly constructed, deployed a half-second too quickly, the comedic equivalent of someone moving through a room they know well in the dark and clipping the corner of the furniture anyway. Vaelith received them without comment, which was also unusual. She normally gave his humor the precise, considered acknowledgement of someone who had studied the form and respected it without being native to it. The silence where those small acknowledgments usually landed was not unfriendly. It was waiting. On the second day, during what was technically a lunch break and was actually a continuation of shift with food present, she asked him, without preamble and without looking up from her display, whether he had understood what she said. Marcus finished the sentence he was typing. He had been composing and discarding responses to this question for 48 hours, running them against various criteria: honesty, self-protection, accuracy, the maintenance of a working relationship that had real and continuing consequence for the people depending on it. And none of the composed responses had cleared all four categories simultaneously. He had eventually concluded that this was because they were all, in various ways, dishonest, and that the only response that cleared the honesty criterion was also the most exposed one. He said yes. She asked whether he had meant what he said. He was quiet for long enough that the hub's environmental system cycled through a pressure equalization, producing its characteristic low resonant hum, like the station briefly clearing its throat. He said that he had meant the part about needing a happy ending. He was genuinely uncertain, he said, about the rest of it. Vaelith set down the container of food she had been holding and pressed her fingertips together in that slow bilateral pulse. Both hands, which he had only seen her do twice before, and which he had come to understand indicated not distress, but the kind of deep processing that preceded something she had decided was important enough to say carefully. She told him that her species did not have a romantic architecture that translated cleanly into the human model. She said this not as a warning or a deflection, but as a piece of information she considered relevant, delivered in the same tone she used to convey case statistics or logistical parameter, present with one particular person rather than enduring it alone. She had been deciding, she told him for some time, whether he was that. The two quiet words had been her conclusion. Marcus looked at his screen. He looked at her. Her pupils were their standard configuration in the afternoon light, vertical and calm, and the faint iridescent shift in her hair caught the panel glow as she waited with the patience of someone who had learned, professionally and otherwise, that the most important things required time to arrive at. He said that he thought he had been deciding something similar without knowing what to call it. She considered this for a moment. She said that was a characteristically indirect way to confirm a significant thing. He said he was working on it. She said she was aware and retrieved her food and returned her attention to her display, and her fingertips ceased their quiet bilateral counting. The queue had 29 entries. Outside the viewport strips, a Dravathi transport was completing its docking approach on the station's lower ring, running lights blinking in the patient, indifferent rhythm of a vessel that had been in transit a long time and had finally, for now, arrived somewhere. 3 months is not a long time in resettlement work. It is long enough for a new influx to arrive and be processed into the queue, long enough for a governance committee to convene, deliberate, and produce a report recommending the formation of a subcommittee, long enough for the east wall lighting panel in the coordination hub to be repaired, and then, within 11 days, to resume its irregular flicker, as though the repair had been a polite suggestion it had considered and declined. 3 months is, it turns out, also long enough for two people to quietly renegotiate everything about how they occupy a shared space, without either of them formally announcing that this is what they are doing. Marcus noticed it in the small things first, which was the only honest place to notice anything. Vaelith had stopped leaving him the better chair. This was because he had finally told her. In the flat, factual way he delivered information he had been sitting on too long, that his back had been significantly better since the station's medical officer had adjusted his anti-grav compensation settings 6 weeks ago, and that she should take the better chair if her back gave her trouble. She had looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that meant she was deciding how to receive something. Then she had said that her back had been giving her trouble for 4 years. He had said he knew. She had said he could not possibly know, since she had never mentioned it. He said she favored her left side when she stood for more than 20 minutes and had twice requested a different workstation height from facilities, which facilities had not addressed, because facilities did not address things. He had simply put a riser block under her station's primary display himself, quietly, 3 months ago, before any of this, and had said nothing about it because it had not seemed like the kind of thing that required comment. It was the kind of thing that required doing. She took the better chair after that. She did it without fanfare, the way she did most things. The new influx was Sarathi, a population displaced by a gravitational event near their home system that had rendered 3 inhabited moons uninhabitable inside 72 hours. The cases were different in their specifics and identical in their structure to every case that had preceded them, which was the most exhausting truth in resettlement work. The disasters changed their coordinates, but not their essential grammar. Marcus had started a second column on his notepad. He did not tell Vaelith about the notepad, because it had always felt private, the paper equivalent of something you keep inside because naming it might change its nature. He discovered she had known about it in the 11th week, when she placed a new notepad on his desk beside the existing one without comment, and when he looked at her, she was already reading her intake cue, and the subdermal luminescence at her temples was doing something warm and very faint, the way it did when she was containing something she had decided not to make large. He said nothing. He put the new notepad in his drawer for later and kept working. Some things did not require comment. He was learning which ones. The moment that the staff of the coordination hub did not witness but somehow knew about regardless. Because the staff of a resettlement hub develop a collective sensitivity to atmospheric change that rivals any early warning system the station's meteorological sensors could produce, happened during the 43rd day of the Sarathi intake processing. On a Tuesday afternoon, when Marcus made what he intended as a reassuring gesture during a particularly brutal hour of back-to-back rejections, and mistimed it by approximately 4 centimeters. He had meant to put his hand on her shoulder. He put it instead on the area just below her collarbone, which was, as he would understand approximately 3 seconds later, and as Vaelith would explain with admirable composure approximately 40 seconds after that, the location of a sensory cluster that in her species carried a specific social and physiological significance that the human gesture of shoulder touching did not prepare either of them for. She went completely still, not the stillness of offense or discomfort but a different quality entirely, something he had no immediate framework for, like a system that has received an unexpected input and paused all other processes to evaluate it. The luminescence at her temples went steady and bright and entirely gold. Marcus removed his hand and said, with the particular care of someone who is aware they have pressed an unknown button and is waiting to learn what it controls, that he was sorry and that he had misjudged the distance. Vaelith remained still for another moment. Then she said, in a voice that was very even and very precise, that he had not caused offense. She said that the sensory cluster he had contacted was not considered an appropriate point of casual contact between individuals who were not in a committed relational context, but that the response it produced was involuntary and physiological, and that the specific nature of her response was more informative to her than she had strictly anticipated. Marcus said he was going to need her to translate that into something a human being could parse. She said it was the biological equivalent of being kissed unexpectedly by someone you had already decided you were willing to be kissed by. The station's ventilation system chose this moment to produce a sound that was, in acoustic profile, almost exactly like a polite cough. It was a maintenance artifact, a pressure differential in the ductwork that occurred irregularly and had been on the facility's request list since year 3, and Marcus had heard it hundreds of times. He heard it now as something else. He looked at the ceiling. He looked back at Vaelith. Her expression had not changed, but something around the edges of it had shifted by a fraction that he was, by now, calibrated to read. She laughed. Not the considered, precisely placed amusement she deployed professionally, but something that arrived before she could organize it, warm and involuntary and briefly unguarded, the laugh of someone who has just been surprised by the fact that the universe is occasionally, against all available evidence, absurd in a tolerable direction. It lasted only a moment. Then she straightened, and her expression returned to its working configuration, and she looked at him with her wide, dark, vertical-pupiled eyes, and said that perhaps they should address the question of appropriate contact points at a time when they did not have 16 open Sarathi cases awaiting review. He said that seemed reasonable. She said she would add it to the agenda. He said he was not aware they had an agenda. She said they did now. He wrote nothing about any of this in the notepad. He had started to understand which numbers were for counting and which were for keeping. By the end of the 3rd month, the Dravathi caseload was 91% resolved, which was as close to finished as resettlement work ever came. The 12 cases that had moved through the gap in the secondary review system were all placed. Marcus knew where each of the 5 families in those cases had been housed, not because the system required him to track it after placement, but because he had checked, quietly, on his own time, and because knowing felt like the completion of something that the notepad marks had started. He did not tell Vaelith this either, and then she mentioned, during a routine case review on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday, that she had been monitoring the post-placement adjustment reports for the Dravathi cohort, and that the family of 5 from the last case, the ones in the photograph with the conserved stillness, had submitted a cultural integration form indicating that the youngest child had enrolled in a station school program. She said this as a logistical observation. He heard it as something else. He looked at her across the space between their workstations. The amber low-light of the station's evening cycle had come on, the same warm dim that had held the room on the night they had worked through the last of the cases, the same recycled air, the same flickering east panel doing its irregular blink above the exit that still read "Today is a Tuesday." 3 new arrival transports were completing approach on the lower docking ring, their running lights visible through the viewport strips in the patient, steady pulse of vessels that have traveled a long distance and have, for now, arrived. Vaelith was pressing her fingertips together in the slow bilateral count, both hands, looking at her display, and he knew now that this meant she was composing something she intended to say carefully. He waited. He had become, over 3 months of practice and intention, genuinely good at waiting. It was the most important skill in this work. He was beginning to understand it was the most important skill in most things. She asked, without looking up, whether he believed that people who had spent years managing other people's disasters were capable of building something for themselves that wasn't one. He thought about it properly. He gave it the full weight it deserved, which was considerable, because she had asked it as a real question, and she would know the difference between a real answer and a comfortable one. He said he thought the skill set was probably transferable, that people who had learned to hold complicated things carefully, to work through obstruction without breaking, to find the small completions inside the large incompleteness, he thought those people might have some advantage. Not immunity, but something. She considered this for long enough that the ventilation system cycled through its pressure equalization, the station's low, familiar hum filling the quiet. Then she said she thought he might be right. She said it in the tone she used when she had already reached a conclusion and was confirming it against the available data. Her fingers stilled. The luminescence at her temples was slow and even and gold. Outside, the first of the 3 transports made contact with the docking ring, and the entire station absorbed the impact in the way it always did. A vibration you felt more than heard, a minor shudder moving through the structure from the point of contact outward, the physical grammar of arrival. Somewhere in the intake system, 3 new case queues were opening. The work was waiting, the way the work always waited, patient and enormous and unfinished. Neither of them moved to begin it yet. Marcus picked up his notepad. He did not write anything. He just held it for a moment, the paper real and specific in his hands, and looked at the